I've spent most of my life wearing a mask. I was a master at hiding my true self, blending into the expectations set by everyone around me. The pressure to be someone I wasn't felt crushing, but I forced myself to fit in, to belong. Whether it was school, home, or even within friendships, I shaped myself according to what I thought was acceptable. My identity was buried deep beneath layers of shame and doubt. I had convinced myself that who I truly was could never be accepted, and so I wore that mask with such dedication that even I started believing it was real. But pretending for so long began eating away at me, little by little, until it felt like I was disappearing. The more I denied myself, the more hollow I felt. Moments of self-awareness hit me like punches to the gut. I avoided mirrors, not just physically, but metaphorically. I couldn't face who I really was. The nights were the hardest. Silence only amplified the voice of truth I kept trying to silence. I'd lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight, wondering if I could ever truly be myself. But the idea of acceptance seemed impossible. So I continued the charade, moving through life as a shadow of who I really was. My days turned into routines, mechanical and empty. I kept myself busy, trying to drown out the truth with noise and distraction. I threw myself into work, studies, social events, anything that kept me from thinking. But the cracks were starting to show. I'd catch glimpses of myself in the mirror, and it was like staring into the eyes of a stranger. The mask was slipping, and I couldn't control it. Even my relationships were suffering. Friends would ask if I was okay, sensing the distance I tried so desperately to hide. But I couldn't tell them. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? The guilt of living a lie became unbearable. It followed me everywhere, a constant weight on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that I'd get over it eventually. But the truth had taken root, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it only grew stronger. I started avoiding people, isolating myself out of fear of being exposed. My thoughts were chaotic, tangled in a web of denial and confusion. I was trapped in my own mind, fighting a battle I was too afraid to acknowledge. The breaking point came on a night like any other. I was alone, the world outside moving on without me. I sat on the floor of my bedroom, staring blankly at the wall. The walls felt like they were closing in, my thoughts consuming me. I couldn't keep living like this. The facade I had built so carefully was crumbling, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. It was terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel, to acknowledge the truth that I had buried for so long. It wasn't just acceptance I was craving. It was understanding, compassion, and forgiveness. I had spent years punishing myself for not fitting into the mold others expected me to fit. But in that moment of raw honesty, I realized that the only person's approval I truly needed was my own. It was a revelation that left me trembling, but also gave me a glimmer of hope. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Admitting the truth to myself was only the first step, but it was a monumental one. It felt like I was seeing the world through new eyes, noticing things I had ignored or suppressed for years. There was pain in acknowledging what I had lost by living in denial, but also a sense of liberation. For once, I allowed myself to dream of a future where I could be unapologetically myself. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. But reality wasn't kind. As soon as I stepped outside the confines of my room, the weight of expectations returned. The voices of those around me, their judgments, their assumptions, they all crashed down like a tidal wave. I found myself retreating again, doubting whether I had the strength to be true to myself. The fear of rejection was overpowering. I kept replaying conversations in my head, imagining the reactions of family and friends if they ever discovered the truth. The thought alone was paralyzing. Isolation became my refuge. The outside world felt hostile, even though the real battle was within me. I spent more and more time alone, allowing my thoughts to run wild. There were moments of clarity where I'd feel at peace with myself, only to have doubt claw its way back in. I'd stare at my reflection, my eyes searching for some sign of who I truly was, but the mirror only reflected the person I pretended to be. It was maddening. But despite the darkness, there was a quiet strength building within me. I started writing, pouring my thoughts onto paper, letting the words speak the truth I was too afraid to voice aloud. Those pages became my confidence, holding the weight of my secrets. Writing became my way of processing everything I had buried for so long, and slowly it became a tool for healing. It was like I was discovering myself for the very first time. The more I wrote, the more courage I found. I started reading stories of others who had walked similar paths, their words offering comfort and inspiration. It was eye-opening to realize that I wasn't alone in my struggle. The world felt a little less cruel, a little more forgiving. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that acceptance was possible. But acceptance didn't come overnight. I still wrestled with doubt and fear, the remnants of years spent in denial. But with each passing day, I grew stronger. I started experimenting with being more honest with myself, acknowledging parts of me I had ignored for so long. It was like chipping away at a stone wall, one piece at a time. And with each piece that fell away, I felt a little lighter. The turning point came during a quiet night when I realized something fundamental. I couldn't keep hiding. The person I had been suppressing all these years deserved to be seen, to be heard, and the only person who could truly give me that freedom was myself. It was terrifying to acknowledge, but also empowering. I couldn't change the past, but I could change how I face the future. I made a promise to myself that night. No more lies, no more pretending. It was time to embrace who I truly was, regardless of what anyone else thought. I still didn't have all the answers, and I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to take that first step. I was done living in the shadows. The first time I spoke aloud about my struggles, it was to a friend I trusted deeply. I remember my voice trembling, my hands shaking as I confessed everything I had been hiding. The words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and by the time I was done, I felt like I had been holding my breath for years. Their response was gentle, understanding, and supportive. It felt like a weight had been lifted, even if only temporarily. But even with their acceptance, I still found myself questioning whether I could be truly honest with the world. Fear kept me from fully embracing myself, like invisible chains holding me back. Yet, the seed of hope had been planted. Knowing that someone could accept me for who I was made it easier to imagine that others might too. And with that realization, I found myself wanting to push forward. Acceptance wasn't a single moment, but a series of small victories. Every time I chose to be honest with myself, I chipped away at the walls I had built. The writing continued, not just as a means of healing, but as a declaration of who I was. It became a ritual, each word carrying me closer to the truth, and the more I embraced my identity, the more I found strength I never knew I had. Eventually, I began to share my journey with others. Not everyone responded with kindness, but that was okay. For once, I wasn't living for anyone else's approval. I was finally giving myself permission to be authentic, to live my truth without shame. The acceptance I craved wasn't from the world, it was from myself, and I had finally found it. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how long I spent denying who I truly was. The pain, the loneliness, the desperation to fit into a mold that was never meant for me, it all feels like a distant memory. My journey is far from over, but I no longer feel lost. I've made peace with my past, with the parts of myself I once considered flaws. My story isn't perfect, but it's mine. And that's enough. I know there will still be challenges ahead, but I'm ready to face them with courage and authenticity. Because after all the years of hiding and denying, I've finally learned to accept myself. And that acceptance is the greatest gift I could have ever given myself.